Good morning, everyone. We're about to get started. Okay. Thank you for making the time today. My name is Lauren Graham. I'm FES class of 2013. And on behalf of the YES Organizing Committee, I want to welcome you all to the third biennial Yale Environmental Sustainability Summit. You can whoop. Today. So YES was founded in 2015 by a group of enterprising alums who saw the need for a space to convene deeper conversations about solutions to big planetary problems, particularly the solutions arising from the intersection of business, entrepreneurship, and the environment. So I want to take a moment to thank all of our sponsors who have helped to make YES possible this year. And the theme for this year's event is Dispatches from the Future. And it asks each of us how we might compel the collective, sweeping environmental action that is needed in the midst of a time of rapid change and uncertainty by looking into the future. Over the next day and a half, you will have the opportunity to build new relationships, expand your knowledge, gain practical tools, and experience the best of what Yale's environmental community has to offer. We hope that your time here leaves you feeling renewed in your sense of purpose, and with a zeal for action to build a future that is not defined by its perils, but by its possibilities. One Yalie who is leading the charge to design this future for the present is our opening speaker, Miranda Massie. Miranda is the director of the Climate Museum. Based in New York City, it's the first of its kind in the United States. Its mission is to inspire action on the climate crisis with programming across the arts and sciences that deepens understanding, builds connections, and advances just solutions. In 2014, Miranda left a career in social justice law to lay the groundwork for the museum, which in 2018 had its breakout year of public programming, with 3 exhibitions, including a 10-site public art installation across New York City. In 2019, programming to date has included a youth spoken word performance at the Apollo Theater and the 5-month exhibition entitled Taking Action on Governor's Island. Miranda's prior honors as a civil rights impact litigator include the Fletcher Foundation, W.E.B. Du Bois Institute, and the Harvard Law School Wasserstein Public Interest Fellowships, as well as a mentorship in residence at Yale Law School. Her Climate Museum guest teaching engagements include the master's programs in interaction design at the School of Visual Arts, in museum studies at NYU, in architecture and landscape architecture at RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, and in climate and society at Columbia University. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to our opening speaker, Miranda Massie.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Am I mic'd? I'm mic'd. Lauren, thank you very much for that introduction. As Lauren just mentioned, I am the director of the Climate Museum. 5 years ago, I left my first career as a racial justice and social justice trial lawyer that had evolved into a role as in the leadership of an impact organization in New York City to start the Climate Museum because we need a massive shift in culture and norms in our consciousness and in our values to support the sweeping action that Lauren described. And being involved in the museum has been a true gift to feel that I'm directing my own time and my life force at the greatest problem that we've faced together as a civilization and as a species has been a massive gift. It's also a real gift and an honor to be here with all of you today. This is an incredibly important gathering, or I should say rather a gathering that has the capacity, to be incredibly important. And for inviting me and for convening this important group of people, I want to thank Lauren and YES, in particular Sarah Smiley-Smith, who, as everybody here knows, is the Dean of Academic Affairs here at FES, and student assistants Norma Moyo and Morgan Pierce. and everybody on the Yes team who pulled this together. This is a gathering that can matter if we decide to make it matter, because this is a room full of people without scale capacity to have an influence. The programs that we'll be involved in together, the conversations we'll have with each other over the next couple of days are on some of the most important topics that we face together: decarbonization, youth leadership and activism for climate solutions, migration and displacement, and how those relate to the climate crisis, and the capacities of smart city technology. But frankly, none of that will satisfy anyone in this room. I'm confident I can speak for Lauren and Sarah in saying it won't satisfy them, and I know it won't satisfy me if all of us don't change our actions and change our own business as usual and go deeper following this conference, even than the people in this room have the habit already of doing. We're in an unprecedented planetary emergency, and it's a moment that's defined by a huge contradiction that also gives us the possibility of moving forward together. The climate crisis is accelerating in ways that we wouldn't have imagined 2 years ago. Right now in the state of California, the hills are burning while the lights are turned off. The electricity is shut down to prevent further fires. I'm sure most people in the room saw a study released a couple of days ago, co-authored by a Yale grad, Ben Strauss, showing that the great cities of Asia and the Middle East will be underwater much faster even than had been previously predicted. Groundbreaking new study. I think it's less than 48 hours old. There's a study like that, guys, every day about the impacts of the climate crisis. Sometimes it's about something that's going to happen sooner than we thought, and sometimes it's about something that's happening right now. But the situation is accelerating, and we need to accelerate with it. If a friend of yours told you 2 years ago that she was moving to California, you might be happy for her, you might be bummed you'd see less of her. But right now, wouldn't your heart clench a little bit with dread and anxiety? Mine would. It's time now. It's time for a new beginning and a new level of commitment to action. And fortunately, we have the inspiration that we need to make that new level of commitment, brought to us by a new youth movement that is led by people who have not had the time that we have had. Most of us in this room, I see some very young faces too, but most of us in this room have had the time, inevitably and damagingly, to adjust to business as usual. Little by little, even as we resist it, we all adjust. That's been evolutionarily adaptive for a very long time. So it's understandable that we adjust. But it's now time to stop the practice of business as usual with small and slow tweaks in response to an emergency that's accelerating. And young people across the globe have put that question to us. So their dispatch from their future is, this is it. The time is really now. We have to change how we talk and how we think, and most of all, how we act when it comes to the climate crisis. So this is an important gathering that can generate leadership and action in the world if we decide together to bring that sense of urgency and importance to it. The youth movement has elevated the question of climate change in a new way on the national electoral scene, as everyone here knows, and its leaders are rightly and justly demanding that we revisit every aspect of the business as usual that has brought us to this point and that allows it to persist. Instead of thinking of this set of demands, even for those of us who believe them to be deeply just, instead of thinking of them as demands being made on us to change in a way that's hard, because they are that, we should also be thinking of them as a remarkable opportunity to see the world with fresh eyes, because there are plenty of reasons to elevate young people on social questions and on matters that require social leadership. Young people have not adapted to the reality that surrounds us. As mentioned previously, they bring creative energy. They also, in this case, there's a special reason for paying attention to the voices of the young. Young people are those who will disproportionately suffer from the burdens and damages of the climate crisis. The climate crisis is a form of intergenerational pillage, and I know that is strong language, but it is true. By continuing with business as usual with small and slow tweaks, we are depriving young people of the opportunity to have a future within civilizational norms as we currently understand them. This should affect everything that we do on the climate crisis, and it should affect how we think about our daily lives. I'll give you one small example from the Climate Museum's practice. We recently adopted an amended mission that acknowledges the centrality of action to what we're doing. So it's no longer enough for us to provide a space, no matter how much people might appreciate it, for contemplation and for dialogue. If our work doesn't result in action in the world, then we will not judge it to be a success going forward. We've elevated youth voices from the beginning in our work. At first, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, the energy and creativity and fresh view of youth, that was a matter of general principle, and it's become more acute with the youth movement. And I want to tell you guys a story about a young man named Otto, who's 18 years old, and who became a docent, one of 29, at our show that ran over the last 5 months in New York City. It was a show dedicated to inspiring civic action on the crisis and to providing people with an understanding that we have the technical solutions. We can do this. That's what the science shows us. To show us also, in a second major space, that the barriers to implementing those solutions are profoundly daunting and include, for example, massive capital flows into the fossil fuel industry, and a massive fossil fuel lobby that has a death grip on our national politics that most people who were visitors found surprising. What do you think the relationship is between the gun lobby and the fossil fuel lobby in the United States? Anyone? What's the relationship mathematically? Call out a guess. 10 to 1, on the nose. Fossil fuel lobby, 10 times bigger than gun lobby. Everyone in this room would say that the gun lobby is a cancer on the body politic of the United States. Fossil fuel lobby, 10 times bigger. On the issue of climate, older people and institutions have a responsibility to listen to the voices of the young, and to listen to the voices of people like this young man, Otto, who became a docent, as I mentioned, in that exhibition. On Climate Week, the day after the September 25th march that turned out to be the largest workday demonstration in the history of our species, Otto spoke on our panel on youth leadership, because we had one of those too. I think that the panel I'll be on storytelling later overlaps with that one today, or else I would be attending it. But Otto said something that I've been thinking about ever since. He's an introverted and self-contained person, and I would describe him as a shy one. But the day before, he had organized hundreds of students to march across the Brooklyn Bridge to join the main mass of the demonstration in Lower Manhattan. And when I asked the young leaders in the panel for their takeaways for the crowd, what Otto said has stayed with me ever since. He said, it's not about who you think you are, and it's not about what you think your personality or your identity is. It's about thinking about what impact can I have? Who do I know? What power do I have? What is my network? What do I control? And then he said the thing that almost made me fall off my chair. It's about what the world needs from me right now. So this shy boy who had gotten kids from schools across Brooklyn to march across the Brooklyn Bridge, 18 years old, telling us really what we need to know. And I thought about it when I read, some of you will have seen that now 1,200 engineers, not artists, not, say, climate museum directors, but engineers, have signed a declaration that before taking on any new project, the climate crisis has to be taken into account. Again, engineers, this includes large firms, major Australian engineering firms that have previously worked with the fossil fuel industry. And they further declared, meeting the needs of our society without breaching the Earth's ecological boundaries demands a paradigm shift in our activities and our behaviors. If engineers can embrace that paradigm shift, then so can and so must we all. And so I thought about Otto's words, about what the world needs and what I can do this morning as I considered the honor of addressing you and what I was going to say. And I realized that the most important thing that I can do here this morning is to call on Yale University to divest fully from fossil fuels and to urge all of you to support Fossil Free Yale, the student organization that is working on divestment. This call for divestment has a long history. At Yale, it long predates the national movement that's resulted in double-digit trillions of dollars and hundreds of universities and colleges across the world divesting, including, most recently, the University of California and Smith College. So again, you don't have to be a climate museum director to think this is a good idea. The San Francisco Fed, the World Bank, the military, and the insurance industry would all tell you that there are grave risks involved in fossil fuel investments. And so to do due diligence, as the chief investment officer of a major university, and we do have the most respected chief investment officer in the country, by the way, but due diligence should include a full embrace of understanding of what that risk is. But that's for financial experts, and that's not me. I liquidated my retirement accounts to start a climate museum 5 years ago. My point is that we should not be paying for things that do harm. And this is the categorical harm in our society. Yale's money will not, Yale by withholding its money, will not stop the fossil fuel industry. It's going to take a lot more than that. But that's not the way that we measure our influence or our leadership. If we measured Yale's leadership by its percentage of GDP or compared to the endowments of other schools, we might even have to say that Harvard is a better place to be. And that's not going to happen. Rather, we need to insist that Yale should be investing in a way that does not do harm. These harms are already happening. The choice we face is super stark. It's burning in the dark in California right now as I speak. It won't be dawn for half an hour. The electricity is out. California is on fire. This is the world of business as usual with small and slow tweaks in the face of an accelerating catastrophe. The choice is stark. The dispatch from the future is that the time is now. We must choose together our common future and our common legacy. I ask each of you to support the students who are calling for divestment, who are calling also for disinvestment from firms that are blocking loans to Puerto Rico to repair post the damage of Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma. These are deeply connected issues, and I urge everyone to engage with that campaign, to use your influence with the Yale administration, whatever form it may take, to call for Yale not to do harm on this categorical catastrophe that threatens, in a way that we've never seen before as a species, everything that we hold dear. Thank you very much. And now it's my huge pleasure to introduce Jon Shenk. Jon Shenk has a BA from Yale from 1991, and he is the director and cinematographer. Let me start that again. He's the partner at Actual Films and the director and cinematographer of The Island President, a film I'm sure many people in the room have seen, which was fantastic, and the co-director of an Inconvenient sequel. He's directed and photographed many award-winning films, most recently an Inconvenient sequel, which was selected to be the opening night film at the 2017 Sundance Festival. It was released by Paramount in summer 2017. The year before, he co-directed and photographed the Peabody Award-winning film Audrey and Daisy, which premiered in competition at Sundance and was picked up as a Netflix original film. In 2011, Jon directed The Island President, which was winner of the 2011 TIFF's People's Choice Award and IDA's Pari Lawrence Award. He was awarded the 2004 Independent Spirit Award for directing Lost Boys of Sudan, and was the DP for the 2008 Academy Award-winning Smile Pinky, and has also received an Emmy for Blame Somebody Else. So, without further ado, welcome, Jon, and thank you for the incredible work that you do.
Good morning. Let's see if I can get my slides on here. Good morning, welcome. It's so nice to be back on campus. I was doing the math, 28 years is starting to sound like a really long time. And the students are looking incredibly young these days. That was 28 years ago. Let me see. Oh, I guess I lost my first slide. Oh, here we go. Okay. Oh, this one? Cool. 5 years ago, my wife and I, who I work with and who's my film partner, received a call from a producer at a company called Participant Media to ask if we would be interested in talking to Al Gore about possibly working on a film, his next climate-related film. And I thought, didn't Al Gore go to Harvard? That is not going to work. But I thought about it, and you know, as many of you know, Al was the star of this incredibly important film called An Inconvenient Truth that came out in 2006, and we thought, okay, we'll accept a private audience with the should-have-been 43rd President of the United States. In reality, the call wasn't totally out of the blue for us. Bonnie and I had met in film school in the mid-90s, and we had worked together on documentary films. We had done films about refugee resettlement, as Miranda suggested, and democracy building. But when it came to climate change, the issue kind of stumped us. Many of you probably can relate to the fact that it's getting easier to personally relate to climate as an issue. But in the 90s, it felt like something that was going to happen in a faraway place to people way in the future. And it felt very difficult to kind of feel the visceral effects of climate change personally. And therefore, for us as filmmakers, it felt like a very difficult issue to tackle. We did know intellectually, of course, that sea levels were on the rise, coastlines were in danger, and that eventually we would, unfortunately, the world would reap the cost of burning fossil fuel for so many decades. But it seemed like among us, it was very difficult to get that emotional response from our peers. And then we met this guy. His name is Mohammed Nasheed. He was the first democratically elected leader of a tiny country in the middle of the Indian Ocean called the Maldives. That might look like an experiment in a petri dish somewhere from Science Hill, but these are actually islands. There's 2,000 of these islands that make up the country of the Maldives in the Indian Ocean. Here's a closer look. As they say about the Maldives, they have no hills. They are arguably the most vulnerable country when it comes to sea level rise, with an average elevation of about 1.5 meters. So as you can see, the vulnerability is just absolutely breathtaking. We went to the Maldives in 2009 to meet Nasheed, who had been elected in this incredibly dramatic democratic election where he unsat a dictator who was funded by fossil fuel interests in the Maldives for many years. Finally won the election in 2008, and he immediately started doing the most amazing public speaking about climate change, talking about how, for example, his country, it was great that they had won democracy there, but what's the point in having a democracy if the country was going to be underwater in a few years anyways? Just to give you a sense of his personality, this is one of the kind of press conferences that he had when he became president.
We are trying to send our message, let the world know what will happen to the Maldives if climate change is not checked. This is a challenging situation, and we would like to see that people actually do something about it.
The world's first underwater cabinet meeting. The guy has a special kind of genius for getting press, but when we met him in person, it was just an amazing opportunity to follow him around with cameras for his first year in office, and he ultimately became a hero on the world stage during the Copenhagen Climate Conference as part of the UN COP process in 2009. We ended up making a film about Nasheed called The Island President, as previously mentioned, and it just chronicled this incredible year in this incredible person's life. Here's a clip of the film to give you a sense of the kind of work we do, and of course, more about Nasheed.
If we can't stop the seas rising, if you allow for a 2-degree rise in temperature, you are actually agreeing to kill us. I have an objective, which is to save a nation. I know it's a huge task. I've been arrested 12 times. I've been tortured twice. I spent 18 months in solitary.
We won our battle for democracy in the Maldives. A year later, there are those who tell us that solving climate change is impossible. Well, I am here to tell you that we refuse to give up hope.
I do like a battle, then. It won't be any good to have democracy if we don't have a country.
Everything is worse than we originally thought. It's gotten much, much worse.
This is a mission, and I have to get it done. We need a deal in Copenhagen, and I feel that Maldives can be instrumental.
President Nasheed, do you think you will get a deal that you think is worthwhile? I presume that you don't want to sign a national suicide note.
Some leaders here say these are the toughest negotiations they have ever been involved in.
India, China, the United States, big emitters. Prime stuff. They're not going to go along with that. It's hundreds of millions of people. You know, Manhattan is as low as the Maldives. This is just one instance when Maldives is asking our friends to help us. We just can't disappear. We just can't.
So we had made a film that had at its center a man, a person who was trying to save the planet, no small task. And we decided to get on a plane and go to Nashville and meet Al Gore in person. We arrive on this beautiful summer day in Al Gore's neighborhood outside of Nashville, and he opens the door and he greets us warmly, and we sit down on his couch, and he tells us that he wants to show us the latest version of his slideshow. And I've gotten to know Al a bit in the last couple of years. His slideshow can range from 3 minutes, you know, if he's doing kind of a cocktail party version of it, to an hour, hour and a half. Everybody's seen an Inconvenient Truth, right? He dimmed the lights that day, and he said, make yourselves comfortable, it's going to be a long one. It was 10 hours of slideshow, all day long. This is a famous picture of Al Gore on the scissor lift to demonstrate the potential rise in CO2 and how it corresponds to global temperature rise over the course of the 20th century from the original film. And the first part of the day was just absolutely astonishing. The first 5 hours was one of the most depressing 5 hours of my life. He is a repository of all the world's images when it comes to the effects that the climate has had on the planet, and they were all completely up to date. You know, superstorms becoming more common. They're calling these things rain bombs now. Wildfires that were mentioned earlier. I come from the Bay Area in California, where I can literally smell the smoke in my bedroom. Just incredibly devastating, not just in California, but all over the world. And of course, this kind of image that happened in India in 2015 during the Paris climate talks, you know, these 500,000-year floods that happen now every year or every couple of years in places like Houston and again all over the world. So it was a pretty rough morning. But we paused and we had a vegan lunch. Al's a vegan now, and his chef, who was this New York-trained French chef, had to learn to cook vegan food. Delicious, took a breath, and we came back, and he started telling us about the progress that's been made since the original film. And it was really, as depressing as the morning was, absolutely mind-blowing for me. I had no idea how much progress we've made on the potential and the cost down curve in solar and wind. And we really do have, as most of you in the room probably know, the tools now to solve this problem. It's just a matter of political will, and a lot of that has to do with getting out of the grips of the fossil fuel companies, but to create more of this. So I'm watching this presentation with Bonnie, and it's kind of like a film in and of itself, and as a filmmaker, I recognized Al's skill in doing this visual presentation, and I start to have this sensation that somehow, this might sound crazy, but that my whole life was leading up to this moment on this couch here with Al Gore. Here we were with this pivotal figure in American history, talking about this, you know, epic global emergency. And even though I'm kind of pinching myself that I was there in the first place, somehow it starts to make sense. Like somehow I'm like the kid in Karate Kid who's been waxing the car and waxing it off until my moment is in the spotlight where I can step up and help tell the visual story to do my part in this gigantic, epic effort to literally, you know, save the human race. And then I realized kind of simultaneously that this powerful realization that the story that we were undertaking with Al was primarily a visual story, that it can't be done without visuals, that we're completely dependent on photography and video to tell this story. And I think one reason I had that kind of tingling sense of kind of a destiny type of feeling is that really, in many ways, is the story of my life. My father was a nature photographer, and as a young boy, my brothers and I would go with my parents to places like Glacier National Park, where this bighorn sheep wandered up to us. My father loved this particular place called the Maroon Bells in the Aspen area in Colorado. This is the California coast in the Big Sur area. He particularly loved snow scenes. My father died a few years ago, and he left us with 10,000 of these beautiful black and white prints. And so I'm now kind of able, with a little distance, to look back on his body of work and contemplate the message that he was, I think, giving to us and to the world, which is that I think kind of at its core is that you should take as much time as an artist or whatever you do in life to do something right and to communicate something that you feel deeply to the world. And I think my father yearned to share the beauty that he saw in the world with his family and his community. This is a picture of me that my father took back at Glacier National Park in 1977, standing on the glacier. And here's a picture of me standing behind my dad, who's taking a picture of that bighorn sheep that I showed you earlier. I think I was about 8 years old at the time. He's holding his Hasselblad camera. I don't know if everybody knows what that is, but it's one of those cameras you sort of look down and the lens points forward. Beautiful camera that was capable of these amazing images. And I grew up kind of pretty much like that, watching my dad take pictures, developing in this dark room, thinking about the images. And of course, at the time, what he knew that I was way too young to realize is that the entire history of humankind's relationship to the natural world, the entire modern history anyway of our relationship to the natural world, really is fueled by powerful images. These images were taken of Yosemite, or what became Yosemite National Park, by a man named Carlton Watkins, who was an obscure photographer in 1864 using very early photographic equipment. And these images ultimately, in the early 1860s, made their way back to Washington, D.C., where they had such a powerful impact on President Abraham Lincoln at a time that he signed the first ever bill to protect that land, Yosemite Park, to be held for, quote, public use, resort, and recreation for all time. It was the federal government's first act to preserve part of our natural heritage for the common good, and it really became the precursor to the national park system, which we know today. Yellowstone came next, and others followed after that. Fast forward 100 years, I think we're all familiar with images like these. This was really the beginning of the modern environmental movement in the late 60s, which got fueled by this stunning picture, which is known as Earthrise. It was taken by astronaut Bill Anders aboard the Apollo 8 mission. And actually, it was taken with a Hasselblad. There's footage of this. I don't know if anybody's seen the new film Apollo 11, but there's amazing documentary footage of the Apollo mission throughout. And when their mission on Apollo 8 was to kind of find a landing spot for eventually landing on the moon, and they were focused on the moon. But when they came around the moon's orbit and they saw Earth rising over the horizon of the moon, it was like a family vacation moment where, you know, somebody sees something amazing out the window of the car, and they were fumbling, and they grabbed the camera, and they were able to snap this incredible picture. Of course, the Apollo mission also gave us this very famous photograph, which was the first time that humans saw the Earth completely illuminated from space for the first time. And a lot of the commentary was just on how amazingly fragile and beautiful the Earth was from space, and how singular it was when you get out and see the perspective of the moon, of the Earth from space. These images, I don't need to convince you probably, but they connect with us, they touch us, they teach us, they get under our skin in a way, I think, and ultimately they have the ability to change us and lead us to action. Visual storytelling is such a powerful instrument, and looking back on this kind of material makes me humble to be part of the film community that's able to take advantage of these types of images and tell stories. During the Apollo mission, partly because of these images, the first Earth Day was established. Millions of Americans took to the streets all over the country, much like the youth protest several weeks ago during the recent UN conference. And there was so much political pressure at the time, the unlikely President Richard Nixon proposed and established the first EPA in 1970. Sorry. Giving away my stuff here. The fact that humans had seen Earth from space in the 1960s had a really profound effect on all of us, our laws, the way we think about our planet. And as a kid growing up, not really being aware of those kind of bigger issues, looking back, I now see that these images kind of wormed their way into popular consciousness and kind of popped up in a lot of surprising ways. This next film had a pretty big impact on me and I think many people, partly because it's incredibly frightening, and I think frightening partly because it's about this idea that there are evil people out there that put their interests ahead of the interests of innocent people living on planets around the universe. You can draw whatever metaphor you want, but I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at this particular clip.
Since you are reluctant to provide us with the location of the rebel base, I have chosen to test this station's destructive power on your home planet of Alderaan.
No. Alderaan is peace, but we have no weapons. You can't
You will
possibly...
prefer another target, a military target? Then name the system. I grow tired of asking this, so it'll be the last time. Where is the rebel base?
Dantooine. They're on Dantooine.
There, you see, Lord Vader, she can be reasonable. Continue with the operation. You may fire when ready.
What?
You're far too trusty. Dantooine is too remote to make an effective demonstration, but don't worry. We will deal with your rebel friends soon enough.
Commence primary ignition.
This next clip is from a movie that I saw a few years later after Star Wars, 1983. The film is called Koyaanisqatsi. I don't know if that rings a bell for anybody in the room, directed by a person called Godfrey Reggio. It came out when I was my first year in high school, and this had a pretty big impact on me. It was the first time that I thought, maybe there's something in this filmmaking for me. It really kind of got to me. I think it made me realize that films could not only be entertaining and beautiful, but that they could lead us to act and inspire change in the world. Koyaanisqatsi is the Hopi word for meaning kind of life out of balance or life in chaos. And it's a little hard to tell from this clip, but I think you get the idea that with this beautiful score by Philip Glass and these incredible images, aerial images of just the most amazing vistas and time-lapse photography around the world, the director starts the film and you kind of have this 10 or 15 minute almost like spell cast on you about just the natural beauty of the world, and then that's interrupted by the strip mining, the shots of the kind of oil industry and nuclear testing. It's just absolutely devastating and beautiful film. This next film was shot about a couple, I don't know, maybe not even 100 yards across the street from here. The scene I'm going to show you was shot right in front of Ingalls Rink, which we used to call the Whale. Is it still called the Whale? At the time, friends and I were thinking a lot about income inequality, or what would later be called income inequality. We sort of thought of it as the haves and the have-nots and the unfairness of that in our political system. In the film, I play the lead role. The year is 1991. I was a senior at Yale at the time. And I have something in this film that a band of hungry people really want, and a chase ensues. I have to warn you, this is not quite the quality level of Koyaanisqatsi, but I wanted to show it because I'm back on campus. The film is called Egg. If anybody wants to see the whole 12-minute silent film, it's on our website at actualfilms.net. After college, I went to film school and graduated in the mid-90s with a master's in documentary filmmaking. And my first job, believe it or not, was the in-house documentary filmmaker for Lucasfilm as George Lucas was making the prequels to the original trilogy in the late 90s. That's me helping the R2-D2 team out. I put my camera down for a minute and had a kind of a life moment of being able to actually help repair R2-D2 for the next shot in the film. Here's another shot of me trying to rescue my camera back from the baddie in the film called Darth Maul. But I want to get back to our story. The lunch, the vegan lunch, I think we left off, we're talking about this amazing opportunity we have with alternative energy. That, by the end of the day, we decided to make a film together with Al, and we started making preparations right away. Before we knew it, we were in Greenland to film the ice melt and destruction that's going on up there that I'm sure everybody is well aware of. Since the first An Inconvenient Truth that came out in '06, we are now facing facts such as the fact that Greenland's ice is melting 4 times as fast as scientists previously thought it would by this point. We all know that, of course, if Greenland does melt, the ice that is there could potentially raise our sea levels 23 feet, which would lead to the kind of devastating coastal loss that we were talking about earlier. This man in the foreground is a guy by the name of Connie Stefan. He's a leading ice scientist from Switzerland who spends his summers on the ice sheets. he explained to us that ice melt often begins as these tiny little dots in the ice. You can kind of see them if you look closely. And they eventually grow over the course of the summer, and the higher the temperature, obviously, the faster they grow, and they become these giant, what they call moulins, which is this giant circle at the top of the photograph. That's me with the rope around my waist, standing next to the tripod, and Connie is screwing in an ice screw so that I don't fall down that bottomless pit there. My wife, Bonnie, has the cap on. She's overseeing the operation to make sure she doesn't lose her husband and filmmaking partner. And of course, looking a little bit concerned on the left there is Al himself. It was quite a moment, and I wanted to show you the video that we took that day. I was told that that water kind of drills down into the ice sheet, sometimes a mile or two down into the ice sheet, and then ultimately out to the ocean. So I'm glad I didn't fall in. It would not have been a pretty ride. We were ultimately blown away by the response to an Inconvenient sequel. It was a complete honor to work on it. One thing that we noticed when we started showing the film in 2017 is the incredible diversity of audience. We showed it to young school children who saw the film and immediately wanted to change their lives and become part of this generation that's now so inspiring the world with their climate action. We also showed the film to investors, to bankers, and because we wanted to kind of make them think about their investment strategy and just how much opportunity there was in the alternative energy industry and how much danger there is in the fossil fuel investment kind of business as usual approach. One story that absolutely blew us away is that in the last couple of years, the country of Norway, which as many of us know is a fossil fuel rich country with all their drilling of oil in the Arctic Ocean, has recently decided to move their entire sovereign wealth fund, $1 trillion, out of fossil fuel investments, the kind of thing that we hope that Yale will do in the near future. This is a seismic change in the history of investing. This summer, I attended an Al Gore event. He does these incredible climate training events where I watched his new slideshow. It wasn't 10 hours. And I was so proud that he is now actually using pieces of the film in his slideshow. So Bonnie and I have just been so proud to see what's happened with this film. It doesn't really get much better than to see your film getting used in all these incredible ways. Here is a clip from an Inconvenient sequel to give you a sense of that film if you haven't seen it. Ooh.
It's supposed to be 70 degrees today. It's freezing here. Speaking of global warming, we need some global warming. It's freezing.
The most criticized scene in the movie An Inconvenient Truth was showing that the combination of sea level rise and storm surge would flood the 9/11 memorial site. And people said, what a terrible exaggeration.
Hurricane Sandy slammed into New York City last night, flooding the World Trade Center site.
Storms get stronger and more destructive. Watch the water splash off the city. This is global warming.
I felt so scared. Sorry.
Despair can be paralyzing, but this to me is the most exciting new development. We're seeing a tremendous amount of positive change. The basis is there, but it's still not enough.
It's crunch time at the climate change conference in Paris.
Still some really tough negotiations going on.
What would it take to shift to renewables? I'm talking about breaking the impasse. Virtually every nation in the entire world agreed to get to zero greenhouse emissions. It is unprecedented.
It's time to put America first. That includes a promise to cancel billions in climate change spending. Our plan will end the EPA
the next generation would be justified in looking back at us and asking, what were you thinking? Couldn't you hear what the scientists were saying? Couldn't you hear what Mother Nature was screaming at you? This movement is in the tradition of every great movement that has advanced humankind. It is right to save humanity. It is wrong to pollute this earth. It is right to give hope to the future generation. Don't let anybody tell you that we're going to get on rocket ships and live on Mars. This is our home.
Remember that picture of me and thank you. That picture of me standing on one of our own glaciers in Glacier National Park. Unfortunately, this glacier is pretty much gone now. I don't know if this is the exact same glacier, but this is a typical of what's happening to the glaciers in Glacier National Park. The yellow line is kind of roughly what it was when I was born in the late 60s, and the red line is where it was 4 years ago, so presumably more melting has happened since then. This is a very bleak time, and I don't want to gloss over that. I'm more convinced than ever that we humans, on the other hand, have the potential to solve the climate crisis. One of the things that makes me particularly excited is how young people are starting to make climate a priority. We see that every one of the contenders for the Democratic presidency is now making climate a priority, and I think that's partly because they see the political pressure from the younger generation. And personally, I'm deeply moved that my two children are now involved in this story and making a connection through images. This is my son, who is a sophomore at Bard College, a couple hours north of here, a photography major. Here he is with my dad's old Hasselblad, doing a school project where he's documenting the interaction of human-made objects interacting in the natural world. And here's a picture that my daughter took in Alaska this summer when she was on a backpacking trip hiking across one of the glaciers in the Talkeetna Range. She came back with these amazing photographs, including this one that she took of the ice melt from one of the large glaciers in Alaska. The instructors on her outdoor trip have kind of a set path where the group was going to hike that summer over a course of a month, and they would routinely approach these rivers in valleys in order to get to the peak on the other side, and they'd have to alter their plans because the cross points are now so widened by increased melt that happens there in the last couple of summers that they would have to hike to closer to the head of the glacier to make the crossing. She was deeply moved by this. She had tears in her eyes when she was explaining these things to me. And she's now using these images in her own presentations at her own school, telling her own story about the climate crisis. Looking at my children's photographs now, and thinking back on my father's photography, I also think about the connection to those pictures of Yosemite that I showed earlier, the photograph of the Earth from space, and then of course Nasheed and his underwater cabinet meeting, Al Gore's slideshow. These things are all made by people who desperately want to show the connection between themselves as human beings and the planet that we live on. Another scientist who we spoke to in Greenland told us when we were there that it is true. Our pinky has been cut off. We have lost things that we will never get back from our planet, but we still have a body. We still have a lot we can save, and that's what I wanted to leave you with as I end my presentation today. Thank you so much to Yes and to Lauren and to the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. I really appreciate the time to speak to you today.
Thank you, John, for that great keynote. So the next part of our programming is our first plenary session of YES, entitled Pathways to Decarbonization. And we're doing this in a TED Talk style, and it features presentations on how to decarbonize carbon-intensive industries that can have a transformative impact on curbing global emissions. And that will be followed by a facilitated Q&A and a panel discussion facilitated by Professor Judi Zimmerman. So they will go in the order of electricity production, transportation, regenerative agriculture, and then the work that's being done to decarbonize Yale. So you can take a minute just to stretch. Don't go anywhere. But just take a minute to get your energy levels back up, and then we'll just start momentarily. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Bartholomew, and I'm here to talk with you today about the electricity sector. I'm going to switch gears a bit and actually talk more about the economics behind it, because that's kind of what I sit in and know. But very excited to be here. Thanks, TS, for hosting. Also, definitely tried to pack too much in here, as I normally do, so I hope everybody else drank as much coffee as I did this morning. Yes, and so I'm coming from Bloomberg NEF. We're Bloomberg's primary research arm. We cover power, gas, renewables, EVs, metals, mining, kind of anything you need to understand if you want to get ahead of the energy transition. So we're going to start off, with the world in 2005. This is every power plant that was online at that time in the US. So we've got our gas in purple, our coal in gray straddling the Appalachian, and then near these like the Uinta and Powder River basins out west. Got some hydro out in the northwest, and then our nuclear in radioactive green. Interesting New England tidbit, there's a lot of red oil up here. In case you haven't noticed, it gets kind of cold, and it gets too expensive to get gas up here in the winter. And the world in 2005 was a very different place. Gas was 2 to 3 times more expensive than it is today. Coal was running baseload, really king of the power sector in the US. And the reigning World Series champs had just been reinstated as an MLB team in Washington, D.C. So like the Nats, the US power sector has come a long way in the last decade and change. You can see kind of going back and forth. If you zoom in right here, this is not, I think it's just kind of funny. You can see this gas plant getting kind of eaten by wind farms. And this is what we've built since then. So this is blue wind cutting up through the center of the country where that resource is strongest. We've got solar coming in on the coasts, and a ton of gas build. Gas prices have fallen about half again since that decade and a half ago. Can anybody guess why there's so much gas here? Just yell it out. Yeah, fracking. This is right on top of the Marcellus, the Utica. Aren't enough pipes to get all that gas out, so you're burning it super cheap. It's great if you're a gas plant. It's really bad if you're coal in that area. So these are retirements since 2005. This is what's gone offline. Pure evil. I'm just kidding. Love studying coal economics. But you'll notice that those coal retirements are strongest where that competition with gas is fiercest. You're also seeing some nukes fall out, which, as we'll see later, is not great if you care about emissions a lot. And then this is capacity and generation over that time frame. So on the left, capacity, on the right, generation. You see a little interplay here, how much stuff actually runs. So these nukes are actually kind of the workhorses of the US power fleet. You see a relatively small share of capacity, but account for about 20% of US generation, and the bulk of our low carbon generation. Something that's striking to me is that this has been about the most exciting and transformative decade and a half that the US power sector has ever seen. You've got some renewable build out, you've got major gas eating into coal, but I think, this looks a lot more like 10 years ago than where we'd imagined we need to be for a lot of ambitious emissions targets. That just tells me there's a lot of work left to be done, and anything new, clean, renewable you're building is displacing something dirtier and more expensive to run right now. So this, I think, is the coolest, most exciting chart, at least for long-term power sector economics. So each one of these bubbles is how much it costs to buy a watt of solar in a given year. This is 1976, like spaceships, not very widespread, 2008, and then today. This is a log scale, so we've gone from $70, $80 per watt in 1976 to 20-some cents, I think, this year. Even since 2010, we've seen the cost of solar panels drop by 85%. Cool thing about this is that if you just put a line through all this stuff, we come up with something called an experience curve. It's basically just saying that for every doubling in cumulative installed solar capacity, we see roughly a 29% decline in the costs of manufacturing a solar panel. And as we'll kind of see later, if you can project out a bit how much you think is going to be built, paired with that rate, you can say something about what you think the cost of solar is going to be in future years. And then this is that for wind. Again, this is a logarithmic scale. This is just dollars per megawatt or dollars per watt for wind turbines. Wind, this also is kind of misleading because wind turbines are getting more productive all the time. So even though we're looking at just dollar per watt here, your wind turbines commissioning this year are a lot more productive than ones just 10 or even 3 years ago. And so we've also seen the cost of wind turbine in dollars per watt fall by about half in the last 10 years. And we've seen actually how this spills into US projects. So we're just looking before at your panels, your turbines, but there's a lot of other stuff that goes into actually putting a wind or solar farm in the dirt. So we're looking at here our power purchase agreements. So each one of these dots is mostly utility, but now sometimes even like Facebook or schools down the road going out and contracting power from a wind or solar farm. And because this contracting process is really competitive, we think this is a good proxy for cost. You can see in the US, it's a pretty clear trend. Benchmark power purchase agreement costs have fallen from about $175 per megawatt hour in 2008, to in the $20 range in recent years. And this is really exciting because all this stuff up here, that's California rate, that's PG&E going out and paying a ton for solar that costs way more than regular power to meet California's renewable energy standards. But as you see these costs fall, right, you're seeing solar and wind go from these kind of niche, nice, like very expensive ways to meet clean energy targets to now competitive sources of new build across the US. And that's what I spend most of my time doing, so this is good for everybody. But it's not really just about cost, it's also about the value of power. So who's seen a chart like this before? Oh God, okay, all right. So what we've got here are y-axis on this side, that's generation, okay? So that's how much gas in purple or solar in yellow, nukes in green, you're producing throughout the day. Each one of these is an average daily profile. So this is in 2013, 2014, 2015, et cetera. And then this black line here is the power price, how that's moving around throughout the day, okay? So 2013, and this is in California, sorry. This is kind of a simple world. You see supply kind of following demand, high in the middle of the day when and then when everybody gets home, turns on their heater, their TV. You can see that price just follows demand throughout the day. Cool, we're chilling. Get up to 2015. Now you've got more solar coming online, and this stuff costs nothing to generate, and it's just flooding the system, cratering prices in the middle of the day. If you ever hear of the duck curve, that's what that is. You might be thinking, oh, this is great, solar, renewables, lowering power prices. It's not great if you want more of it to get built. You're not going to build more solar if the power you're selling from it is worth nothing. And then this gets even crazier as we get into more recent years. Now you've got a lot more solar coming online. Prices are getting killed in the middle of the day and then screaming up through the heavens in the evening when that solar is falling offline. And all these other power plants are having to adjust and ramp up very quickly to make sure that the lights stay on. So this duck curve becomes more of a Loch Ness monster. I think that curve fits pretty well. New, non-parametric regression. I think we've got to test that out. So you've got markets saying, I don't need this cheap power in the middle of the day. And you've got them saying, but I will pay you a pretty penny for flexibility, anything that can ramp up in these evening hours. All right, you guys hear that? Yeah, that's batteries walk-on music, okay? Be flexible, buy low, sell high. This is the cost curve for batteries, or sorry, the learning curve for batteries. Battery pack costs declines have looked a lot like solar in the last decade or so, come down by 85%. This is just how we see those progressing forward. Interesting kind of subplot here is that solar, wind turbine costs driven down by those kind of power, wind, solar economies of scale. Batteries, for power implications or applications at least, the costs are really being driven down by all this manufacturing capacity we see coming online to meet demand for EVs. Okay, all right. I'm already flirting with going over time, so I'm just going to give you super spark notes. We do this modeling exercise called New Energy Outlook to try to see how these trends might play out over the next, how far away is 2050? Like 30 years-ish now. So basically look at how electricity demand is going to evolve year to year, season to season, intraday, and say, okay, if demand rises, are you going to build, what's the cheapest to build? Is it solar, wind, gas, coal? Hint, it's not coal. But you see solar and wind becoming increasingly competitive as we go further out into the future, again, mostly because of those cost declines. We're also looking at kind of second tipping point, which is when does it actually become cheaper to build a new wind or solar farm and displace a coal or gas plant that's actually already in the ground, right? Whose fixed costs are already out of the way. The result, we see capacity ballooning here. And in terms of generation, we go from about probably in the neighborhood of 10% power from renewables today to about 20 in 2030, and then around 35 in 2050. Something you'll notice is that declines after 2030, they kind of level out. Increases in renewable generation kind of level out after this area, or rather gas remains strong, and that's just because gas in the US is relatively cheap. It's just the generation mix over time. And I think one of the key takeaways here is that the way markets are set up right now, and the way we see these costs playing out, markets are not going to get us all the way there to a decarbonized power sector. So this is just the share of zero carbon electricity over time. You notice, oh my God, why is it staying flat? To 2050, you're losing all the nukes. So again, kind of hinted at earlier, if you care about emissions, you should care a lot about their economics. And then this is just the emissions story, where from 2019 to 2030, we see power sector emissions falling by roughly another half. But then as you lose a lot of nukes, those emissions kind of level out as you go further out into the future. I just want to wrap up really quickly. This is kind of super brief of where we see the economics going, and thinking about the way markets are set up right now. You want, like, it's for power to be like cheap and reliable, and now we're starting to play with this clean part. So if you want to get to a fully decarbonized power sector, you either have to improve the economics, whether that's through new technologies, new market designs, or getting at a lot of those clean electricity targets that we're seeing now, redefining the market paradigm. Awesome. Thank you.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me? It's great to be here at Yale, although don't tell Princeton I said so. I'm going to talk about U.S. transportation decarbonization. So transportation is the highest greenhouse gas emitting sector in the United States, and it's fourth globally. If you look at the left-hand chart, this is the pie chart globally. This is transportation in red at 14% globally. This is U.S. pie chart, and this is transportation 28%. So this is a big source of emissions, and that's what we're going to talk about. U.S. transportation greenhouse gas emissions only recently overtook the power sector as the biggest greenhouse gas emitting sector because of some of the dynamics that you heard about in the last presentation. The top line here, this is the power sector. This is 2000 to 2018. This is the navy blue is the power sector that has been coming down a bit. And then this is transportation in red that's went up a little bit, down a little bit, pretty flat. And in 2016 was the crossover point where the U.S. transportation sector overtook the power sector as the biggest greenhouse gas emitting sector in the United States. Going forward, the U.S. Energy Information Administration reference case projections, this is a business as usual scenario, says that transportation emissions will decline but then start to go up again. And so to focus, this is a busy chart. Here we go, focus. This is petroleum. This vertical dashed line is the 2018, so this starts going forward as opposed to history. And this dark blue, blackish color is transportation. This is the transportation sector. And you see it sort of goes down and then it comes back up. This is a business as usual scenario that assumes that the Obama era standards for vehicles, for greenhouse gas emissions and fuel economy stay in place. As you may have read, the Trump administration wants to roll back these standards. If the Trump administration is successful in doing that, this chart will actually look considerably worse. I mean, it's not great, but you won't get as much of a dip and you'll start to go up much faster. So these standards that the current administration wants to roll back are super important. So what do we do if we want to change what those reference case projections look like? So a good way to think about it, I think, is that greenhouse gas emissions and reductions result from the interplay of technology innovation, market forces, human behavior, and public policy. And public policy happens at multiple levels: international, federal, state, and local. And this is complicated, which, you know, maybe is the bad news. There's lots of things that you have to think about, and they all interact, and it's complicated. But it also means we have a lot of levers to pull and a lot of scope for action. So there's a lot of opportunity to reduce emissions in many different ways. And it also means when one of these factors is not going so well, so for example, US federal policy on climate is not going very well right now, you still have other things that you can do, that you have a lot of scope for action with your other levers, your other levels of public policy. So it is really important that federal policy is going badly right now, but it's not the only thing that's important. There's still a lot we can do that's positive. So in the United States, reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transportation is actually tougher than it is for other energy sectors. And this is from the US Mid-Century Strategy for Deep Decarbonization. It came out in November 2016. There was a lot going on in November 2016, so you might have missed it. But we actually have in the US a US Mid-Century Strategy for Deep Decarbonization that you used to be able to find on the White House website, but you can't find it there anymore. But you actually can find it on the United Nations website if you're interested. I worked on this when I was in the Obama administration at the Department of Energy. And this left-hand pie is the 2005 emissions by sector, and the right-hand pie is 2050. And it's by sector, and this yellow is transportation. And this is a scenario in 2050, which we called our mid-century strategy benchmark scenario, which got an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions economy-wide by 2050. And we found that most of what was left when we really pushed on all of the sectors was transportation. Transportation was the hardest sector to get emissions reductions in. So we got deep reductions everywhere, but the yellow, this is most of what's left. So transportation was toughest. So why is that? Let's unpack this just a little bit. This is the pie that's sort of subdivided into other pieces for transportation emissions. So this is our slice, transportation. And then the kind of sub-slice is this brown is cars and light trucks, sometimes referred to as light-duty vehicles. So that's most of U.S. transportation emissions at the moment, but there's still quite a bit coming from heavy-duty trucks and buses, aircraft, shipping and boating, others, and rail. If the Obama-era fuel economy standards stay in place, this subsector is expected to shrink, and then we can focus our attention more on the other harder to decarbonize sectors. But if, again, these standards are rolled back, then we'll still have a lot more work to do in this sector as well as these other subsectors. So why is it so hard to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the U.S. transportation sector? And a good way to think about this, I think, is that there's a four-legged stool driving transportation fuel use and emissions. There's vehicles in yellow, fuels in brown, vehicle miles traveled, and system operations in red. And so why is this so hard? Well, kind of in a word, it's oil. So let's see if this is... So the U.S. transportation is over 90% dependent on oil. And low oil prices are a challenge. So in the United States, we are much less willing than many other countries to tax oil. So it's very cheap oil, so if you're not willing to tax it, then there's not a lot of incentives for people to use less of it. So that's not been a strategy that at least this country has been willing to employ. So the biggest success we've had here in the United States has been these vehicle fuel economy standards, and more recently the vehicle greenhouse gas standards. And we've actually reduced, since the 1970s when these fuel economy standards first came into place, we've avoided about 2 trillion gallons of gasoline. It saved consumers about $5 trillion over that period and avoided about 17 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions. So this has been a huge success and could be, we could keep going on this and really continue to make bigger and bigger differences. And that's been our strategy, and it's been successful. We have found the other legs to be more difficult, and in particular, it's been very hard to switch away from oil because oil is a really tough competitor. When you think about what a gallon of gasoline can do for you, sort of from an engineering perspective, it's, a gallon of gasoline can move several thousand pound vehicles 30 miles at least. And that's a lot of work, a lot of energy, a lot of work to do. So you've got this fuel that really packs a lot of punch. And it's also very easy to transport, and it's benefited from over a century of mutually reinforcing innovation and infrastructure build-out between the oil supply and the gasoline supply, moving that around, and the vehicles that use it. So this is a really tough competitor for any type of alternative fuel, and you just have to, I think it's important to recognize that when we're thinking about what else we can do. What's new, and this is sort of exciting, is vehicle automation, vehicle electrification and other zero-emission vehicles, mobility as a service, which is one way to talk about companies like Uber and Lyft who do ride-hailing, and information technology. And depending how these things play out, we could have a totally different future on transportation. But it's not necessarily the case that things are going to get better. They could get a lot better or not. So for example, vehicle automation in and of itself could increase vehicle miles traveled dramatically because there are a lot of people who can't drive but could be driven. And so you could wind up with a lot more vehicle miles traveled, which could be okay if their vehicles that they're being driven in are clean, if they're zero emitting, and or if we do better on ride sharing. And I distinguish ride sharing from ride hailing, because ride hailing you could still be winding up driving around or being driven around as a solo rider. But if we actually have more ride sharing where we pack more people into vehicles, that could make a huge difference. So things could get a lot better or not, depending on how all these things play out. So what we did in the U.S. mid-century strategy for what we contemplated doing in the U.S. mid-century strategy for cars and light trucks was to continue to increase fuel efficiency standards, basically the opposite of what the current administration is doing. Developing low-carbon transportation fuels and vehicles, including electric vehicles, fuel cell vehicles with hydrogen, and biomass vehicles, and also reducing vehicle miles traveled through smart growth and other strategies. For the other subsectors of transportation, besides light-duty vehicles, it's a tougher nut to crack. There's actually a lot of range of views about what we should do about those other sectors. A lot of people are working on this. We had a big push on biofuels, but there's also potential for hydrogen. And most people think, this is on the right-hand side, most people think that we're not going to be able to use batteries in airplanes, and we probably aren't for very large planes going overseas, for example. These very large planes going very long distance, that you're probably not going to be able to do electrification. But there is one company which I think is interesting, this isn't getting a lot of attention, called Zunum Aero, and they have an interesting proposed business model innovation as well as technology innovation. And they're thinking of having small planes go from regional airports, one regional airport to another regional airport, and not go through a hub. So you don't have to pack a lot of people into a big plane and go and collect them and then go through hubs. Instead, you could have small planes going from one regional airport to another, and these small planes going short distances could potentially use batteries. And that also has interesting benefits because it would save people time if you don't have to go through a hub, and people value their time. So it's kind of an interesting business model innovation and technology innovation. We need both business model innovation and technology innovation. Just as a reminder, 2050 is 31 years away. I think my predecessor mentioned about this. I think a lot of times we think 2050 is 50 years away for some reason. We forget that the century is not so young anymore. And so it's pretty soon, and it's very similar to the approximate lifetime ranges for various capital stocks. So we're actually making investments now that are still going to be in place for decades and sometimes even centuries. So we actually need to get going right away. In fact, we should have gotten going yesterday. And so if you look at, for example, cars are last 15 to 20 years, the urban form, which drives what you can do, or which motivates or determines what you can do on transportation, can last hundreds of years. So we really have to get going to change our infrastructure and investments so that we're headed in the right direction. So key takeaways, hopefully, are that deep decarbonization is a challenge, but it's doable. Transportation needs more attention. It's a tough sector to crack. Time is of the essence. We have to change faster. And there are no facts about the future. Our emissions are up to us. They depend on decisions and actions that we take with respect to policy, markets, innovation, and behavior. And happy to take questions.
No, I know. Here we are. Good morning, everyone. I'm Darcy Schreiber-Knowles, and I'm here with Dr. Bronner's, the activist soap company, and also as a proud 2013 alumna of the Yale School of Management. I came to Yale in 2011 to transition my career from traditional environmental conservation to progressive sustainability and work on regenerative agriculture and food systems change as the vanguard of the environmental movement, in my opinion. So I'm humbled and I'm excited to be here with you all today and share with you some of what we've been working on at Dr. Bronner's related to agriculture. So I'm going to talk about three things. One, who is Dr. Bronner's and why do we care about agriculture? Two, what is regenerative organic agriculture? And three, I'm going to share with you about the regenerative organic certification that Dr. Bronner's has been developing over the last few years with Patagonia and Rodale and a number of other partners. That is a very exciting development for the future of ag. So who is Dr. Bronner's? Founded in 1858 in Germany, today, 5 generations later, we are still a family-owned, family-run company. We're based in Southern California, Vista, and we are a certified B Corp and a registered benefit corporation in the state of California, using business as a force for good. We manufacture soap and other personal care and cleaning products, food items, and our mission is to make products of the highest quality with the utmost social and environmental integrity and to dedicate our profits to making a better world. These are our products today: soaps, liquid soap, bar soap, coconut oil, toothpaste, hand sanitizer, lip balm. We distribute in 28 countries around the world, but here in the US, we're the top selling natural soap, and we have 80% of the market share for natural. So why talk about agriculture? Soap is chemically very simple. As anyone who's seen the movie Fight Club or done enough DIY projects at home will know, you can make soap out of any fat and any alkali. Add a little heat and pressure, and on the other side of that reaction, you have soap, glycerin, and water. So we make our soaps out of certified organic, certified fair trade vegetable oils, coconut, olive, palm kernel. These are agricultural products, and they are certified organic to the USDA's National Organic Program, which is the food grade standard. Soap is agriculture, and so many of the things that we eat and wear and touch and buy have agricultural inputs. So why does that matter today? That matters in part because globally, agriculture is responsible for almost a quarter of the emissions. Paul Hawken's book Drawdown has 100 strategies for what we can do to address the climate crisis. And of the top 25 strategies, 14 have to do with agriculture. So what's wrong with conventional agriculture today? It's incredibly carbon intensive, petrochemical heavy, degrades soil, harms animals, harms workers, harms our bodies, and for the purposes of today and the conversation of decarbonization and the future of the environmental movement, it is contributing tremendously to the climate crisis. But the good news is there is a better way. And it is not expensive, and it is not new technology. What is regenerative organic agriculture? This is a holistic approach to agriculture that takes into account soil health, animal welfare, and social fairness. These are aspects of conventional agriculture and organic agriculture that are missing. Organic is terrific, but it's not good enough. It's not dealing with the climate crisis. So there are things about, there are strategies that we can employ, specific tactics to sequester carbon in the soil. And for our conversation today and tomorrow, this is perhaps the most exciting and salient thing about agriculture. That if you utilize these strategies here, if you do no-till or low-till, if you rotate crops, if you use cover cropping, if you have integrated animal management, you can actually, using our friends, the plants themselves, and good old-fashioned photosynthesis, you can sequester carbon out of the atmosphere into the soil. Plants take CO2 and they split it up into oxygen that we all need on this planet and carbon. And that carbon becomes the building block for the plants, the trunks of trees, and the roots, shoots, and leaves and fruit of whatever is growing. And it is also sucked into the soil and stored there. And if you employ these regenerative organic practices, you can maximize your carbon storage. So regenerative organic agriculture can be a huge part of the climate stability solution, not just a less bad, not just a counter to conventional agriculture that is contributing tremendously to the problem we're facing on the planet. This is what regenerative organic agriculture looks in Dr. Bronner's supply chains. So we have mint farmers in India using conservation tillage. This is where our mint oil comes from for the famous peppermint tingle. We have palm oil grown, coming from palm grown in Ghana, and this is cover cropping, or ground cover that you can see in Ghana. We have fair trade farmers and holistic integrated animals in Sri Lanka, where our coconuts are coming from. Those of us who are from cities may have an idea of what a farm looks like. And the truth is that depending on where you are in the world and what you are growing, farming looks really different. So an application of regenerative organic practices, again, depending on where you are, can look different. The farming is different. But the data we are seeing about the impacts of these practices is very similar, no matter where you are and what you're growing, and it is incredibly exciting. Dr. Bronner's measured our entire carbon footprint for the first time, including Scope 3 in 2018, and what we found based on our modeling is that the small number of farmers who are intentionally employing regenerative organic practices in 1 year sequestered 36% of what would have been our carbon footprint for that year. Now, what that means for us, based on our calculations, is that by about 2023, Dr. Bronner's, as a consumer products manufacturing entity, will be a carbon positive company. That when you buy a Dr. Bronner's bottle of soap, you are actually having a carbon positive impact, helping to cool the planet. This is hugely exciting, and we're working towards that. We've got a long way to go. 36% is not 100, but we are also one small company, and 44,000 metric tons is not going to do it for our planet. So how do we scale this solution? We do it in partnership. The Regenerative Organic Alliance is an organization that Dr. Bronner's co-created with Patagonia and Rodale. Rodale is the leading nonprofit research organization in the US for organic agriculture. And working with standards and certification experts, farmers, soil scientists, animal welfare activists, labor justice workers, we developed the Regenerative Organic Certification, which takes organic as the baseline. Again, organic is critical, but it is not cutting it. And it says, okay, adding in soil health, animal welfare, and worker and social fairness. How can we farm in a way that saves the planet? We developed this standard that has 3 different tiers. We know not everyone can be organic right away. In fact, only 1% of the agriculture in the US is certified organic. It's expensive and it's time consuming. But what we see with regenerative practices is that when you begin, as soon as you begin, you start to see the benefits in soil fertility and productivity, in resilience, drought tolerance, because your soil is healthier. And so farmers will immediately see the benefits, and then we move them along the path to this North Star of the possibility for agriculture to be part of this climate solution. We took into account a number of different equivalencies. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. Folks have looked at soil health, animal welfare, and social fairness for a long time and know what they're doing. So we'll add these wheels to our party bus and move forward together. There are 21 courageous brands who have been piloting this new certification for the last year. Everything from cotton to rice to wine to chocolate. And these companies are all over the world, small and large, in many different regions and countries, and have been experimenting, poking holes in the standard and strengthening it, saying, okay, you actually can't have animals grazing on a rice paddy. Okay, we'll adjust this. And you can have children working on farm if it's an organic dairy farm in Wisconsin that is Amish. Okay, so we've broadened, we've tightened, and this is an experiment, and we don't know how well we're going to do, but we're doing it because we have no other choice. The time is now, and the tools are available. Dr. Bronner's is really proud that our palm oil supplier in Ghana, Surrender Palm, has been a part of this pilot, and the audit for the certification was just completed a couple of weeks ago. Many people around the world, rightfully so, think of palm as a destructive product, but this palm is regenerative. Instead of the agricultural system destroying things or even sustaining, this is making things better, this palm. We're really excited about that and proud. This is dynamic agroforestry. Here's a plot in Ghana. We have a model where farmers are training and demonstrating to other farmers what is possible when you use intercropping and when you use ground cover cropping. And we're very excited. In the tropics, again, dynamic agroforestry looks different than other permaculture models in the US and the global north, but nevertheless, it's working and it's very exciting and can sequester a tremendous amount of carbon while at the same time providing more livelihoods for farmers, or better livelihoods for farmers. So we hope to have all of these pilots completed and audits completed by the end of 2019. And NSF, which is the standards body holding this certification, will take the feedback from the completion of these audits at the end of the year and release the final regenerative organic certification to the marketplace in early 2020, hopefully along with a couple of certified products that will have a logo that lets consumers know that when you buy this jacket or beverage or bar of soap, you are helping to sequester carbon and lift communities out of poverty? What if everything we bought and ate and used and built with and lived in sequestered carbon and lifted communities out of poverty? The tools are at our fingertips and the time is now. And I'm really excited to be here with you all over the next couple of days and talk about how we can scale this solution. This is the world I think we all want to live in. And we'll get there together. Thank you.
Hello, I'm John Bollier. I'm the university's vice president for facilities and campus development. So we've heard a lot of great presentations about different sectors, and my presentation is how those various factors kind of come into play with an institution like Yale. I've been at Yale a long time, 28 years, and was involved with the development of the goal that we're currently working against in terms of greenhouse gas reduction. It was put in place in 2005, and at the time, proposed legislation such as McCain-Lieberman were in play, and Northeast governors, Eastern Canadian premiers, and we landed basically being consistent with our regional goals. And we have made good progress. We will meet our goal, and largely in the way that we thought we would. It was a big leap of faith at the time when we undertook it. As an architect, facilities professional, I didn't have a clear understanding of exactly how we would get there, but we knew we had to. During the last 15 years, we adopted this goal, and yet we had unclear plans exactly how much we would grow. Yet we grew significantly, and we're meeting that goal despite having grown both square footage-wise and in terms of personnel. I don't think that the last 15 years have been very instructive to me in the sense of thinking about two further tranches of 15 years from now to 2035 and then on to 2050. And it seems like you can project somewhat 15 years. It's very hard to project that second and 15, and yet you know the trajectory you need to go on. And if I look back at where we had been and what we need to do, we don't have enough full campus participation within the greenhouse gas reduction. It's been largely a central administration initiative, and it can't be that going forward. We can't continue to grow the way we grew in the last 15 years, and our growth has to be accommodated within our existing resources. That, by necessity, implies greater participation, greater involvement within the process. 15 years ago, the scope 1, 2, and 3 definitions were not as crisp as they are now. Our goal was based on the square footage that tied to our power plants that we could absolutely measure. Going forward, we will change our goal to then be in line with scope 1, 2, and 3, where properties we lease and all the things that we own, it's all inclusive. And so our goal involves 20 million square feet. If you look at how we are getting to our goal, it's in 2020, the last 15 years, you can see that expansion of campus added 28,000 metric tons. And we started out at 263. A big factor which will not come into play to quite the same degree going forward in terms of our own actions is we implemented cogeneration put in 14 megawatts of cogeneration at the medical school where it didn't exist before. We changed the turbines at Central Power Plant that were not as efficient as the latest models, and reduced emissions there. Those options we don't have to play, and we know that we can see that we're only about 8 or 9% cleaner than the grid in terms of emissions. Over the next 15 years, the future is electrification, and you have to believe that within the next 15 years, we will be in a position where the import of electricity will be cleaner than we can self-produce. We're incorporating that into our thinking now about how do we renovate buildings and get them such that they can operate electrically based, and meaning you have to tighten the building envelopes. You have to, in the Northeast, where we have periods of time during the winter that are severely cold, you need to have the envelopes tight enough such that you can operate them using 120 degree water rather than 180. And it sounds kind of in the weeds, but this is the kind of thing that needs to happen if we're to catch the wave of the electrification and be able to reduce our emissions. And so we're incorporating that into our thinking about how we're going to go forward. To put in context what we have, we have 400 buildings. So 400 buildings, 100 of which produce 60% of our emissions. So on average, each one of those buildings, 0.6% of our emissions. You can see that laboratories and cultural properties, which means museums, they are, sticking with laboratories, a quarter of our space and yet 50% of our emissions. This is an area that has to be addressed significantly and deeply going forward. Right now, our average emissions were that red bar on campus. By 2035, we're seeking to reduce it to the middle bar. Ultimately, our goal at 2050 would be 80% reduction of our emissions from 2005, decarbonizing the campus, but that gets down to 4 metric tons per 1,000 square feet. This is a huge, huge challenge. We'll revisit this chart in a minute. So if you put this in context, in terms of numbers, you can see that in 2005, we were tracking 263,000 metric tons. That was against our central plants. You can see that it was 20 metric tons per 1,000. We will achieve 12 metric tons by 2020. But there's a lot to do, right? And so I'm currently chairing a small committee that's trying to respond to our president saying, how quickly could we achieve carbon neutrality? And what would it potentially cost? And how would you do it? What is a very ambitious goal and yet a realistic goal? What it has an aspect of aspiration to it and yet is not unrealistic? We understand that we need to be more aggressive than our current goal. We were early adopters in 2005. Plenty of people or institutions are currently committed to carbon neutrality sooner than we are. We need to change that, and we will. If you look forward and say, if we were to get to our goal of 4 metric tons per 1,000 square feet, and you look at the upper 3 lines, campus size, energy supply, consumption. The consumption is the part where we need to double what we've done in the last 15 years. And what we've done in the last 15 years is not insignificant. This is not an easily achievable thing. As said previously during the transportation discussion, oil is dominant because it's so effective. You break carbon chains that liberates tremendous amounts of energy. If you put in context, if we were to eliminate all of our emissions today using ground source heat pumps displacing natural gas, so we're not wildly dirty. We use natural gas for 95% or 98% of our production of energy on campus. But if we use ground source heat pumps for everything, and you do the numbers, it takes an acre of land to displace 500 metric tons. And if you do the math and say we need 500 acres to accommodate the 265 metric tons that we have, you can see the degree to which other technologies require greater resources. And so we can't do it solely on keeping our current practice of utilizing buildings. We have to tighten our consumption, combine it with renewables. We do see ground source heat pumps as being an effective way, as being a bridge to electrification, because in terms of solar, you're comparing it to what you otherwise would have imported. And as the grid gets cleaner, that benefit reduces. That same concept of taking an acre and saying you put solar panels on it, what does it displace? It displaces about 300 metric tons of carbon, but that's going to degrade over time because the grid will be cleaner and you can import. So we would need yet more acres, if we put solar everywhere. This is a difficult challenge, and it has to get to the way we utilize buildings. I've been talking about buildings, but the Earth's environment doesn't care where the carbon comes from. Scope 3 is important. And we see Scope 3 as being essential to get community involvement within any greenhouse gas goal that's adopted. I'm sorry, this is just a chart showing. I thought it was on my prior slide, subsequent slide. Like almost, I would suspect, any institution of this size, the Scope 3 emissions are actually greater than the Scope 1 and 2 emissions. These are, we third-party verify our emissions for the last 5 years. We don't report Scope 3 because there's such softness in it. In particular, business travel, I think that's wildly understated. These come from translating dollars of spends using various ratios. Not all travel done on campus goes through central records, and so you don't have accurate data. But if you take the big red chart, red portion, about a quarter of that's associated with buildings. So the notion of using our buildings more effectively so that we don't have to build new buildings takes a big hunk out of a portion of that red, as does changing your materials for renovation such that they're less carbon intensive. And we'll be pursuing that as well. But we see this as a principal means of involving the community. This is our chart just graphically. Back to this, the science area really needs addressing, and we do have strategies for changing how labs are used. And in summary, we need greater involvement by the campus community. We need more efficient use of space. New construction, when it occurs, has to be carbon neutral. We have to take offline the inefficient so that our portfolio improves. And we need to reinvest in legacy buildings to accommodate HVAC. In closing, we know that absolute emissions, we will not get to absolute zero. We know in the near term we need improvement. We're working, I'd like to introduce Dean Takahashi, if you could raise your hand. Dean, a former investment professional, key person in our endowment, retired recently, is leading an effort to identify and pursue offsets or carbon. His name of his group is Carbon Reduction Lab, and he can meet with anyone who's interested in the room outside to the left at lunchtime if you want to talk about it. But we're going to need offsets in order to reduce our emissions, but they have to be real. They have to produce benefits for the earth now, and that's what we're into. So, thank you.
sure you guys have a million questions after all of these presentations. I'm going to take the first one, and then I will certainly open it up to the audience. And I think what I heard from all of you, interestingly, is that we really need these public-private partnerships, that this isn't going to come from either sector on its own. And I'm wondering if you can each just reflect for a moment on how you're pursuing public-private partnerships, or how you decide which entities that you want to partner with as you go forward.
So I'm actually just doing market research, so I'm not really fighting the good fight as much. But it was very interesting to hear all your perspectives, because a lot of our other teams are tracking, how corporates and other entities are, responding to internal and external pressure to try to decarbonize. So that's something we're trying to better understand and also learn from.
I would say the market is a public-private partnership, but okay.
We chose to partner with Patagonia, who is another for-profit private business, also mission-driven, and with Rodale, a non-governmental, nonprofit organization, research-based, as our key partners in the regenerative organic certification. In terms of the public sector, there are subsidies for conventional agriculture that are not advantageous for organic farmers, and as businesses, the business community needs to act whether or not there are policies in place. And so we've found partners that have mission alignment and that bring different skills to the table, different knowledge than we have, but that see that same vision.
So I don't do the kind, I'm sort of like, I don't do these individual partnerships, but I guess I would urge people to think beyond the sort of traditional way we think about that companies are either good guys or bad guys, that a lot of companies are full of people, and the people in them, a lot of them actually want to do better environmentally. And I think a lot of times we're attracted to the companies that are already doing great stuff, and that's great. But I think it's also worthwhile to work with companies who have a lot of emissions and try to help them reduce them. There's probably going to mess up this story, but I think it was Willie Sutton, who was a bank robber, and was asked, why does he rob banks? And he said, because that's where the money is. So I would urge people to go where the emissions are. Work with those companies who have high emissions, not ones who are hopelessly committed to those emissions, but companies who are actually trying to figure out how to do better. And you can find a lot of opportunities to work with people, and then you can empower the people within those companies who want to do better.
I think our partnerships our most productive ones are with consultants who help us on our building construction, but also how we operate our plants. And like you say, there's dedicated people within many of these companies, and I think the key is to latch on to those that are creative and leverage them. By our partnering with them, they can go out to other institutions and implement the same kind of approaches. An example is we're going to be renovating Klein Tower beginning in spring. And in its design, we worked with an architect and engineering group, and the engineering group had particularly creative engineers. And we're implementing a process by which the reject heat from that area benefits this building. So beginning to think about buildings as clusters. Well, to do that, the engineers had to be open to experiment and push the envelope. And that kind of a thing, I think, is our most beneficial thing that we do in partnering.
Great. All right, I am happy to open it up and take questions. Yeah?
Ed Meyer, former state senator. Mexican Energy Authority said to us that the most effective way to reduce carbon is to have a carbon pricing and taxing system. I wonder how you feel about that, and if you think it's important, why none of you in your very fine presentation this morning have mentioned it.
I'll take that. As a closed environment within the university, we do have a carbon charge. I find that the carbon charge is wildly too low to, in fact, change decision making. And we're a closed institution where it's not an open free market. I fully endorse, embrace, support the notion of carbon through a carbon charge or tax through the entire country. But in terms of within an organization where you have many self-support schools and then you have others centrally supported, I find that the changes that individual actions can affect consumption and therefore drive to behavior change doesn't occur. But what I just talked about science buildings, I think we're on the cusp of maybe changing that, where we can come up with enough local control that we can have a tax that has meaning because they can have that much variability in how they consume energy. And that is what we're pursuing in this next 15 years.
So carbon, I mean, economists are correct that a carbon price would be the most efficient and effective if we could actually enact it. So the problem we're facing, and I've been working on carbon pricing and would fully support carbon pricing if we could get it, but the reason a lot of us are working on, I guess, plan B to some extent, you know, that if we can't get the carbon prices, because we see that it's just so politically challenging, and it's not just this issue where taxing or charging people is a problem. I mean, this is across the board in the United States. We have a huge problem in the United States having a reasoned conversation about what we should tax and how. And this is just part of that problem, and it's just really, really hard to get in place the level of carbon tax you would need that would actually reduce emissions dramatically. You could imagine, I think, a more modest carbon tax that's part of a broader set of policies, and then it would give you some assist. But it's possible, and I work towards that if I whenever I can. But I think there's a reasonable chance that we won't be able to enact the magnitude of carbon tax that you'd need by itself to solve the problem.
Yeah, I want to add that we'd be supportive of that also, and yet at the same time, the market for ecosystem services is emergent. And when we're working with smallholder farmers who can barely get by, and we've got to start within our own supply chain and then build the market from there, demonstrate what's possible. We suspect that Dr. Bronner's, once we are carbon positive, once we are sequestering more carbon through our regenerative practices in our supply chain, then we are emitting and we are carbon positive, then we may have more carbon credits to sell on the open market to companies or organizations interested in making that neutrality claim. We have purchased RECs for our Scope 2 emissions that we were unable to otherwise handle at our factory. And so that's an example of a market-based mechanism. It's a self-imposed tax, if you will. And so for organizations that want to be at the vanguard, whether or not there's a tax that the government has proposed or levied on businesses and other entities can step up and move toward carbon neutrality on their own.
Yeah, I think I'd echo a lot of the sharp points that were said, and we'd love to see it, but in the meantime, it seems like the world is moving on, and there are other ways to achieve your goals, like for RECs and RPS targets mentioned. And also kind of interesting subplot is that these renewable electricity targets started as kind of footholds for the wind and solar industry. And now you're seeing states like California, New York, a lot of recent activity. People or state legislatures are saying, all right, this is the tool we've got that people actually support. Let's use this to drive deeper decarbonization.
I have the phone.
Oh.
I'm Paulo Barreto. I'm graduate from this school. I'm from Brazil. And just one mention about the carbon tax, but people are talking about the carbon dividend. That would be a way to make this more interesting for political debate and bring money back for the people that pay the taxes. Is there any traction in this direction? So that's the main point.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest in policy circles and political circles, and that would be a way to go forward where you're actually giving the money for people who don't know. You would have a carbon tax, the proceeds would come in and they'd go right back out to citizens and consumers. So you'd make it much less regressive, which is one of the issues with carbon taxing, that you could wind up hurting the less well-off in favor of well-off, at least as a percentage of their income. And that actually would be a very rational and potentially could get political legs. But at the moment, there isn't a serious move towards that. But sanity could return on multiple levels at any moment. So please be ready. But at the moment, it doesn't have traction.
Please.
I would like to know, I'm looking at Darcy, but others too. How do you find and enlist the smallholding farmers that are going to do these things differently? And Judi, for like people in the transportation sector, how do you get them on board and find them?
Through partnerships is the short answer. In our supply chain, the map that I showed of the supplier partners that we work with are all smallholders, and we've found and developed and nurtured those partnerships over time. As an American company based in San Diego, we have been committed to having feet on the ground at our supply chain, and that's uncommon. I've never heard of another business where if there's not enough organic and fair trade raw material in the world to meet projected demands, that company will set up that vertically integrated supply partner and work with local nonprofits and other organizations on the ground in the place where that raw material grows well to ensure that there are smallholder farmers that are benefiting from that process. And the fair trade certification that we hold for our supply chain, it requires that there are annual audits by third parties, and there are farmer level interviews. So it's painstaking, deeply committed work, and it depends on where you are. But those of us who are trying to do this work are finding each other. And farmers want to do right by the soil, and they want to stay farming, and they want to learn from other farmers. So rather than Dr. Bronner's coming in and saying, hey, here's how you can find more productivity in your soil and have additional revenue streams by this crop diversification, we work with farmers who teach other farmers. And through the certifications that we rely on, these third-party audits and networks, we're able to make sure that farmers are supported. But there's a beautiful aspect of the Fair for Life Fair Trade certification that we hold, where the premium that we pay for the raw material goes into a fund that's democratically administered in the community where that raw material comes from. And that fund is used for things like subsidizing compost that makes sure that the smallholders in India that want to be growing in this way have access to more affordable compost to be able to do that. So there are a lot of different ways, but those are a few of the ones that we employ.
All right, let's take one more, yeah.
Just follow up with that question, if you could, obviously very ballpark figures, but the percentage of the costs of implementing a program like that are borne by the different participants. So the amount that you invest into that process, the NGOs or the other people who identify the participants on the ground, and whether the participants themselves pay things, because some of the economics of fair trade, it actually winds up that the farmer himself pays for some of the services that, and how does this all come out?
Yeah, I don't have percentages for you. That's an interesting question. But what we've seen is that for our supply chain, we have needed to invest capital up front, and we have the privilege as a privately held company to do what we want, and we're committed to building these supply systems. We are committed to supporting farmers, and the fair trade certifications and the organic certifications that the farmers in our supply system hold mean that they can command a premium for their products. And the regenerative practices that I described means that they have more income and their farms are more resilient. So this is an economically terrific solution for at the farm level. For brands, right now, it's an investment and it's an experiment. That on-pack certification that we are hoping to have for some of our products starting next year, that's required a huge investment on Dr. Bronner's part in kind in terms of staff expertise and volunteer work, and then also capital, flying to the places on the ground where we're working with our farmers and our local partners. The Serendipalm, the palm oil supplier that we helped establish for our bar soap palm oil, that was not an economically viable company for the first 5 or 6 years of its operation, and Dr. Bronner's needed to front that capital. And it is now an economically viable and profitable business that is growing with customers, not just Dr. Bronner's for that palm oil, but other entities in Europe. And that's not all of our organic and fair trade projects have succeeded in that way. We've had some failures and learned along the way. There is fraud, there are natural disasters, but if you are willing to have patient capital investments, this is really the only way that we can ensure that we're not trying to do business on a dead planet.
Right. Yeah, please.
Hey, Lucy Ann. So we've heard two things this morning. One, that we need to divest from fossil fuels, and that the reality of the research right now shows that oil and gas is the cheapest option. My questions for you, Judi and Brian, are what are your thoughts on how we decarbonize the sector that's selling carbon? How do we look at oil and gas and think about decarbonizing that?
So I don't know if my opinion will be as popular in this audience. So I think it's important to distinguish among the fossil fuels. So the fact is, as we saw in the first presentation, that a lot of those power sector emissions, reductions that I showed, were gas outcompeting coal. And gas does have carbon dioxide emissions, but they're half what coals are per megawatt hour generated. So the shift that we've seen from coal to gas, which could keep going, it's within fossil fuels, but it actually is really helpful to the environment. The other thing that's going on is that there's a lot of exciting innovation in something called carbon capture, where you can actually burn coal or gas, or this can be applied to various industrial processes, and you can just capture the CO2 before it gets into the atmosphere. You can bury it deep underground, and you keep it out of the atmosphere. So when I think about this problem, I'm not like, the keep it in the ground slogan isn't my slogan. My slogan is keep it out of the atmosphere. So you could have a system where you still use some fossil fuels as long as you keep its emissions out of the atmosphere. You wouldn't want to do the whole thing that way because you'd have to do so much carbon capture, but it could be part of the solution. So I do think it's important to distinguish among the fossil fuels, to realize that some part you actually could be able to continue to use if you do carbon capture, and I would think of it that way. But you're absolutely right that, to me, it's not, I am very angry at a lot of the oil company lobbyists for a number of reasons, but it's not just about them. It's really about the fuels are very good at what they do. And so we have to find things that are better. And that's a lot of the work I do, that try to invent things and innovate and encourage things that can outcompete them. And we're doing that. We're starting to do it. We need to do it more. But renewables and electrification of vehicles and hydrogen, I mean, there's just biofuels, there's a ton of innovation that has to be nurtured and pushed forward and is already beating them out in certain applications, and we can do more and more of that.
Yeah, and just to back that up, I think it is important to, as you noted, that coal to gas fuel switching has really accounted for the bulk of recent U.S. emissions reductions. I think it comes down to, like you said, kind of two things. One is just willingness to pay, whether you're putting some kind of carbon capture and sequestration apparatus on top of a gas plant or burning hydrogen or something through it. It's going to cost more than it does to burn gas. You're just trying to do something more complex, more expensive, more energy intensive. So that's part of it. And then the other part, again, just technology innovation. We already see like gas and solar and storage kind of showed simplified use today, but varies a lot by market, but really going head to head and kind of duking it out on the margins.
Great. I think lunch is up, so please join me in thanking all of our panelists.